Just a start, huh?
It's encouraging.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And it's nice to reconnect with you after all this time. And when I retired as a community psychologist 2 years ago, they reburied the Massasoit, Osamequin, behind my house in Burrs Hill Park. And this is the monument there, and you could see some of the, where his remains, and along with the remains from 42 other native grave sites, were reburied in May of 2017. We believe that the Massasoit remains are in there because there was a gold lace that was described as a gift to him, and that was found in one of the graves. So there's quite a long story of that, but let me move on to somebody probably more familiar to you all, and that's our friend Roger Williams, who, after all, is responsible for our all being here and speaking English for the most part. Okay, you're familiar with some of the locations around this community, probably less so. How many people have been to Slate Rock Park? Anybody? Yeah, one person there. I hadn't been to it before, but that's a monument that it's over off Gano Street on Williams and Gano. And okay, you haven't been there, right? And you can go over there and look where the rock that he landed on isn't in existence anymore, because it's 50 feet below the surface of the ground, and it was blown up in the process of moving it in the late 1800s. But Roger's probably gotten more familiarity with this community than anyone else. And but what few people realize is that the way Roger came here was from Salem. Remember, he kind of left after they were about to kick him out, or just prior to their kicking him out. They wanted to send him back to England because they didn't like some of his ideas, okay? But he escaped and came down to meet with Osamequin, the Massasoit, who is living in what we call Sowams, or the southern area. If you're familiar with the Warren Town Hall, you'll see above the main door, I don't have a picture of that here, but there's a frieze over the door, and it says Sowams 1621, because Roger came down and stayed with Osamequin for 14 weeks, recovering from his trip through a brutal winter. He walked from Salem, try that sometime, and was sheltered here at Margaret's Rock, which is just over the Warren line in Swansea on private property, sometimes called Margaret's Cave, though it's not much of a cave. It's really kind of a place where you could make a lean-to shelter. And he recovered there over that 14-week period of time, and only to leave and go up to Omega Pond. I don't know how, I was talking with Steve earlier about visiting Omega Pond. Anybody remember Omega Pond? Okay, you've been there. It's not easy to find, is it?
Well,
you know where to go, right? But it's in East Providence on William Street, and across from Omega Pond, you'll find the spring, or at least a marker that the Williams family placed there. You'll also find the Daggett House, which is one of two of the oldest houses, 17th century houses in East Providence. But Providence itself, you're probably familiar with some of the places. This is the location for the Roger Williams Memorial, the National Park down on North Main Street. And I hope if you haven't been to the Visitor Center, you owe yourself at least a half an hour stop there sometime. They're open 7 days a week. They have a great video there, and you might get to talk with some of the rangers, including John McNiff, who is probably one of the best experts on Roger Williams. This is a depiction of what Providence might have looked like in 1650. This would be North Main Street. Up here would be the State House, and way in the back would be Newtoconnicut Hill. How many people have been up Newtoconnicut Hill? Oh, good. I've never been there before. I'd never heard of it. But that's the western boundary of the city of Providence, and really the meeting place for the 4 tribes that occupied this area. The Narragansetts, which you're familiar with because you're in Providence, the Nipmuc, okay, who are a little further north up into Massachusetts area, the Massachusetts Native tribe, okay, but the largest tribe in the area at the time were the Pokanokets. And I know everybody's going to say the Wampanoags. Well, the name Wampanoag was never used prior to 1700. It was Pokanoket territory, Pokanoket land. But after the King Philip War, if you were Pokanoket, you could not speak the language. And if you said you were Pokanoket, you could be shot on sight. So obviously they stopped saying they were Pokanoket. So we hear this term Wampanoag, which is kind of the Indian nation in southeastern New England. The one location that you can find in downtown Providence that predates 1700 is the location of the Weybosset Bridge. If you ever stopped there, I never did until I got into this project. There's some wonderful interpretive signs at the east end of the bridge there, just before Market Square. And you might want to look at that because it explained for the first time how Providence began with this little neck of land where the bridge now sits. This is the 8th bridge. That was the place where if you wanted to walk from the western side of Narragansett Bay to the eastern side, not take a canoe, which many did, you'd have to walk over that one little peninsula there at low tide. Well, of course the English weren't going to put up with wading across the water, especially to drive their cattle, whatever, to market, so they built a bridge there in 1660. And guess who the toll taker was at that bridge? Roger Williams. You got to make a living somehow. So here we see the tribes. This is the southern area. These are the tribal names here, and you can get a little better idea. This is a map that Thomas Bicknell put together around the turn of the century, of the 20th century. So, as Steve was saying, people have lived here for at least 8,000, possibly 10. Maybe there were a few hunters who came in here in 12,000 years ago. As soon as the glaciers receded, basically, people began occupying the area. And they lived very successfully. The estimate is around 70 to 100,000 people living around here. So, you know, if as a European you ever thought that this country was vacant, you got another thing coming. It was occupied by dozens of nations of people who had lived here for a long period of time. And they began making contact in the 1500s, particularly around trade and one thing or another. But it wasn't until the Pilgrims landed in 1620, what made that experiment, if you will, unique from what had been going on in Virginia was that they brought women and children to begin with, and to the native people living here, they knew something was up when you bring a family, as opposed to the traders who had come by just as men and didn't stay long and left. So things were going to change. But what this group found when they finally landed in Plymouth, or what was called Patuxet by the native people, was a village of bones. Because 3 years prior, there had been a series of epidemics that had literally destroyed the population. 90% of the people living along the coast were dead. So many and so rapidly that the living were not available to bury the dead. 2,000 people. It's as if a nuclear bomb had blown up over Plymouth, okay, leaving nothing in its wake, and no few native people who were out on the Cape, and that was about it. So the native population, the Pokanokets, who were led by the Massasoit, waited to see what was going to happen. They were concerned that if they went to greet them, that the same fate would befall them, that they would die as well. So they waited until the following March, and the Massasoit shows up with 60 warriors and sits down with John Carver, who was the leader of the Pilgrims at the time, and hammers out a treaty. That treaty guaranteed the safe existence on both sides, and really set in place the opportunity for English people to come into this area and settle for the next 50 years without the kind of difficulties that the Virginia settlers had with the native population. Miles Standish was one of those leaders from the Pilgrims, along with Ed Winslow. And between the two of them, they discovered this particular area to be full of, what they were looking for: open land. If you think that the place was full of virgin forest, thickly settled, you would be wrong, because Sowams was described, even by Verrazano in 1624, as open land for leagues of distance. Okay, I've taken a Google map of Barrington here, Tyler Point, and one of Warren, and erased the trees so you could get some idea of what was going on there. That was the kind of land that the English really favored, because they were looking for places to raise their animals and grow crops. And unlike England, there were still plenty of woods around and good old timber that they could use. So they set up a trading post in 1632 and gradually moved into the area. One of the first settlements was a group from Weymouth, who came down to what was Rehoboth at the time, is now East Providence, and the Newman Church and the Ring of the Green, if you're familiar with the history of that area. That was a successful development there and brought many people in, having, quote, purchased the land from the native people. And everybody says, well, it wasn't fair, it was too small an amount, it wasn't negotiated. Well, what you really have to understand is that the native people never thought land could be sold or owned. That's a crazy idea, much as the animals in the forest are sold or, owned by somebody. This is given to all of us. And the token of appreciation for the right to use the land for specific purposes was what that gift was about, that exchange. It wasn't a purchase, it was an acknowledgement. Okay? So 1643, the Newman Church begins, and soon there are mills that are set up across East Providence along the 10-mile river. Anybody been to Hunt's Mills? Good. Oh, we got a historian in the group here. I'd never been there before I started on this project, but it's a terrific place to stop. It's along Pleasant Street, and you can drive in there. There are interpretive signs. You get to see not the original mills, obviously, but at least the river where those mills were constructed. That was an example of the kinds of growth that occurred around this area, so that the native population was shrinking further and further until nearly all of the population was only occupied the Bristol Peninsula. And by 1675, only about 700 native people were left from 7,000 that had been there in the 1620s. Why? Well, there were more epidemics, 1632 and later. There was also the stress of occupation, if you will, by the English. And not to say that there was a specific deliberate attempt on the part of the English to eradicate the native population. It's simply what happened when you had these two cultures trying to occupy the same area with different needs and different expectations. So, 1675, not far from where I live in Warren, a war breaks out. English villages from Swansea all the way up through Deerfield are burned. There was an attempt, if you will, by the native population to basically sweep the English back to England. And had it not been for a change in tactics that Benjamin Church employed, that is, using the native guerrilla style of fighting as opposed to the British stand and shoot, they might have succeeded. By the 6 months into the war, not only had many English people retreated to Newport, where they were safe at that period of time, but some actually went back to England. And if that process had continued, we'd probably be speaking French, or maybe we would still not be here. It would be native territory. But the war ends with the killing of King Philip, the Massasoit son, in Bristol, and then the enslavement of any remaining natives who were not only enslaved but often traded for African slaves in Barbados, because the African slaves, once they were here, didn't know their way around and couldn't escape. Unlike the native people who, if you didn't like your condition of slavery, you just leave in the middle of the night and go join a tribe in Maine or New York. So there are a few places left from that period of time, and if you look in your brochure, you'll find a large map. If you go on the website, you click on any one of those on the map on the website, and it'll take you to a whole page describing that. And though I'm only going to be able to give you a brief talk, and I'm going to be finishing in 5 minutes here, you can discover a whole lot more on that website. As I was just talking to Art earlier, I'm getting into the tour business now, and we're going to see if we can do some 17th century tours in this whole area and kind of bring that to life. And we'll see how that goes, as they say. This is the site over in Bristol where King Philip was shot, and the one marker. The other is the outbreak of the war, is in Swansea, a little. It's easy to find, but most people never go there. That's the Miles Garrison. This is what the Garrison House looked like at the turn of the 20th century, but was probably a stone enclosure back in 1675. We've lost nearly all the English buildings from prior to the war. There are only a few left. I'll show you a few of them in a minute. After Philip was killed, Church negotiated the peace treaty, if you will, with Anawan, his lieutenant, up there in Rehoboth. And if you want to stop, you can walk up Anawan Rock. You might also want to read the book Mayflower, if you haven't already. How many people have read Mayflower? Okay, it's totally misnamed. It's not about the Mayflower. It's about the King Philip War in this area. And many people delight in reading it and say, oh, I drive by that place every day. So definitely worth a read. Philbrick's an excellent author. So here are the remaining sites in Providence. We have the North Burial Ground, where only a few people were interred before 1700, including Chad Brown, the first pastor. Remember, Roger Williams was never a minister. He was a Baptist for about 6 weeks. And then after that, worshiped with his wife in his own home and didn't think the churches should exist. Okay. Stephen Hopkins' house from 1714 is the closest you can get to what houses were like in the 17th century. Nice place to visit, but it's not 17th century. You can go up on Newtoconnet Hill on the western side of Providence, and get a great view looking back at the city. Well worth it. We're getting better weather. I recommend taking the hike up there. And you can go over to the State House, right over there, and look at the charter from 1663 that Roger and his buddy Benedict Arnold, the grandfather of the Benedict Arnold we all hear about, who was the first governor of this state, but he had Rhode Island, or Rogues Island, down in Newport, and Roger had Providence Plantation, so it was kind of a split setup. That's why we have the longest name with the shortest, smallest state. So the remaining houses, who's in Barrington? Thank you. You can see the John Martin house. It's you can't go inside, but you can drive by it every day easily. In Warren, the Hale Noons Farm. You can visit the Martin House over in Swansea. It's on Route 6. It's open July and August Sundays from 1 to 4. So that's the only house from the 17th century that you can visit. And then there's a privately owned William Hunt House in Seekonk, Joseph Reynolds House along Hope Street in Bristol, and the Kingsley House in Rehoboth. So the people I work with, and who I just spent yesterday up renewing their covenant on the top of Mount Hope in Bristol, are the Pokanoket tribe. This is the group of people who the colonists thought they had dispersed. Some people say genocided, but in any case, the tribe is alive and well, and I work with them closely now, and we're doing a number of things. In fact, they're talking at the White Church in Barrington Thursday night at 7 o'clock. Anybody's welcome to attend. Okay, it's a public event and a chance to learn a little bit more about the tribe. This is William Guy. He's the Sagamore, the 10th generation descendant on his mother's side from Osamequin. So, when you get home, take your brochure, look up the SowamsHeritageArea.org website, or do it on your phone. It works just as well. And you can explore all around here, and better yet, get in your car or on your bicycle or even in your kayak and go look at some of these places. I'm in the process of looking for funders for 8 interpretive signs in 6 communities. Bristol, I've got funding for Warren. Actually, I think I have funding in Bristol. But Swansea, 2 in Swansea, and then Barrington, Rehoboth, East Providence, and Rumford. So if you want your business name on one of those signs, talk to me. I'd be happy to accept your donations. About $2,500 a sign. 5 businesses, $500 each. We got it made. So that's it. And I thank you very much for your rapt attention. If you want to hear this all over again, it'll be on the website and this video. So thank you very much.
We have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has any.
Yes?
How do they communicate if one group just came from England and stepped off the boat and met an Indian who had not?
Well, when you're talking about how the native people and the English people first communicated, starting in 1620, well, not fortunately, but it was the case that some of the native people were taken back to England in the 1500s, including Squanto, Tisquanamon, who was captured 3 years before 1620, taken out of the Patuxent village there while people were still alive and well, ended up in London, learns to speak English, and then comes back just before the Pilgrims land with another trading ship, and walks into the village, lo and behold, starts speaking understandable English, and from there, and there was at least one other person who could do that, and people gradually learned the language. I hope you're familiar with the fact that Roger Williams himself created an entire dictionary. He wrote on one trip back to England in 1643, wrote Key to the Languages of America, and really laid it all out in terms of how to talk to people. So people were learning. The other side of it is colonists who were teaching native people to speak English because, and particularly to read English, so you could read the Bible. The Bible was the book. There wasn't much else. And you had to know that Bible and you had to read it. So in order to Christianize the native people, they had to be taught how to read. And I was just up in Natick on Friday night. They had one of the Eliot Bibles that was created by native speakers who, under Eliot's supervision, translated the entire Bible into Algonquian language. And you can read that now. It's all online. Yep.
What is the oldest house in Providence?
Why? What is? Probably the Daggett House. It's a little fuzzy in terms of 1680, 1690 or so. That's the one on William Street near Omega Pond. There's also the Walker House, but that house, they did core sampling on that, and it's probably after 1700, though we think there are pieces of that house that predate 1700. There was another question here.
We have an estimate of the number of some indigenous people still living here, remnants
The
of...
Poconokeets
Yeah.
are 200 to 250. I was with about 40 of them yesterday. But they, people move around and, they live in different places, but they're still affiliated with the tribe. Okay?
David, thank you very,
Thank
very
you.
much.